All right, everyone. We want to introduce to you all our guest this week. He is a professor of political science at Marymount Manhattan College and the author of several books, including the book we are here to discuss with him, is A Cultural History of the Punisher. Please welcome Kent Worcester. Kent, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So Ken, thank you for joining us on the podcast. It is our tradition to do a cheers in before we get into the thick of it. If you don't want to, you don't have to join in, but cheers.
Cheers, Ken.
Cheers. Okay.
All right. So tell us about yourself. Who are you and why the Punisher? And also tell us briefly about this book.
Well, I don't want to go into too much background, but I think it's kind of interesting. I grew up in a world where I wasn't really allowed to read comics except for comic strips in the newspaper, which I loved. But Mad Magazine was banned in my house and so on and so forth. And I've always had a kind of almost, illicit fascination with drawn images and with things my parents didn't want me to read. And there was some of that with the story of my relationship with the Punisher. I arrived in New York in 1983. I had been living in Cleveland, and Cleveland was a tough city, but New York was even tougher. I drove into the city in August 1983, and there was just such a well, let's put it this way. I started to read comics as a kind of escape from graduate school a few years later, and I came across the Mike Baron run. And I thought it would make it a really interesting character to write about. Right? I mean, this is 35 years ago.
Yeah.
But the key point was that everything we were talking about in graduate school was interesting, but had nothing to do with the politics of New York City in the 1980s. And Mike Baron's run seemed more connected to how people were talking about crime and politics and how the city was shifting than anything I was learning in the classroom. So I think of the Punisher as a kind of alternative means of understanding the world we live in, a kind of unconventional way of understanding the world we live in. He's a kind of refraction. And I just wallowed in it for several years writing the book.
Heck yeah. So then follow-up question to that is, we ask all of our guests on the show, what got you into like the nerd world? And do you have a favorite hero outside of the Punisher, if the Punisher is your favorite?
That's a good question. I mean, I think I was always a bit nerdy. And again, it was partly the whole how much popular culture was kind of censored in my world. So, for example, my brother and I were allowed to watch, when we were quite small, we were allowed to watch an hour of TV a week. And that hour would be Star Trek.
Star Trek, yes.
So I think that's possibly the starting point, but I can't explain why, old movies pulled me in, old monster movies. Friends of mine at school in eighth, ninth grade would talk about how stupid 50s movies were, and I found them absolutely enthralling. When a crab crawls out of the edge of a beach, just put me in that cinema seat and leave me alone and let me watch the crab monster get the romantic couple.
I love that. And then do you have a favorite hero? It doesn't have to be a superhero, but outside of the Punisher, I don't know if the Punisher is your favorite, but outside of the Punisher, do you have a favorite and why?
I would say with the Punisher, I think even people who love the Punisher have an ambiguous relationship to the Punisher.
Mm.
I mean, I think that even the most diehard fan will have to acknowledge that some stories are just completely gruesome, and that this character takes things way further than even the angriest real person would ever want to take things. So there's an edge to the character that I find absolutely fascinating, and I will always buy Punisher stories. But to say he's a favorite, it's hard to say. Let's put it this way. I generally prefer Marvel to DC. I might as well lose some readers right there. And that's it. I'm not getting that guy's book. And I genuinely prefer the kind of gritty urban corner of the Marvel universe. So if I'm in a store, let's say I'm in Forbidden Planet and there's no Punisher, I'll look for a Daredevil. I'll look for a Spider-Man. I'm interested in the city. I was taking my stepkids a few years ago to see the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie, and Reese said, "Do you have any of the comics?" And I thought about it, and I was like, "No, it's in space. It's not in New York." And, I enjoyed the movie, but it didn't make me want to read about their adventures in space.
Hmm. That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah.
I
I
think,
mean, you have to either to understand this book, you have to understand that it's about New York City. And there are plenty of people for whom New York City is an interesting subject. This is just an unusual way of talking about the last 50 years of New York City history. And one of the points I make is that almost everybody who writes about the Punisher writes about him as a Vietnam vet. But very few of his stories are set in Vietnam.
mhm.
Far greater number are set either in New York or in big cities that are reminiscent of New York, right? And the issue of American foreign policy represents a tiny fraction of Punisher stories. And the issue of crime, street crime and mob-led crime, represents half the stories. I mean, I'm pulling that number out of my head, but I have read them, so I think it's close. So I don't know how to. I know how to. I think I know how to reach comic book readers, right? Like, the publisher and I put an ad on in the Comics Journal, and I'm doing podcasts such as this, and this is by far the most important of them. And I think I know how to reach comics fan, and I've been a comics reader since the '80s. And I was looking for that escape from graduate school, but I have no idea how to reach people who are interested in New York and who don't know that this is an incredible way of telling the story of the recent history of New York, or one person's version of the history of New York.
Right. And speaking on that, in the preface of this book, you touch on like the memories of the Upper West Side and like
Hmm.
Big Apple Comics and Happy Burger specifically,
Hmm.
places where you would go to have like conversations and discourse that kind of like took its roots while debating what you what you read and what you were looking into.
Hmm.
Um, and so, do you think places like that are kind of like the foundation of landscapes of cities and communities over like the more cliche like Starbucks and generic retailers and things like that to where like the local
Hmm.
environment almost feeds more into those conversations because you can relate to the landscapes around you.
Hmm. That's an interesting question. Um, I mean, there are things about the Upper West Side that have changed profoundly, and I gesture towards that. I mean, the crime and that side of things is of course one of them. But some of the eccentricity has been squeezed out by high rents. I remember there used to be a store in the '90s in Columbus that was called Opera and Comics. And he sold opera CDs, opera sheet music, and superhero comics in just big piles. And that kind of just idiosyncratic vision is harder to find. And some of it's retreated to the outer boroughs or further out in search of cheap rent. But it's still it's still a 24-hour city, and it's still a city wrestling. I mean, let's put it this way. It's a city where crime not only dropped under, say, Giuliani and Bloomberg, but then it just stayed low until COVID, right? I mean, all during de Blasio. And you might say, well, de Blasio did this right or Bloomberg did that right. It doesn't matter. The crime rate was sort of astonishingly low. and then COVID knocks it up. And within the publication of the first like quarterly report on the murder rate, and there's a tick up, and people are like, "Oh my God, it's the '70s. The '70s are back." The scars are so deep that the trigger is just a feather, right? It's a hair. It's like, oh my God, bam, the city's back to where it was. So I'm interested in kind of rhetoric and reality and the way in which our rhetoric shapes reality and the way in which reality itself does have its own. There are actual facts, and far fewer people are going to die at gun or knife violence at the hands of people, strangers or neighbors or family, in 2024 than in 1979 or 1989.
Yeah.
But how we talk about it is not necessarily an exact reflection of what's actually happening. So I think those terrors are part of the story.
Oh, this is
Part of
kind
the
of
story of the Punisher, right? I mean, it's part of the story of New York and it's part of the story of Punisher. And I'm not sure there's any character in literature, not just comics, who captures. I mean, you have to go maybe to Death Wish, Paul Kersey, but a character who captures that kind of New York trauma.
yeah. I think you kind of answered this already a little bit, but I'm gonna ask it anyway because we have it written down. But
Okay.
so through your understanding and research, how how do you feel about Frank Castle becoming such a cornerstone in the Marvel comic and graphic novel world so quickly, despite being like a brutal vigilante, compared to many of our, the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and stuff like that. And then how do you think this changed comics and storytelling in general through that medium?
Hmm. Well, it does take 10 years for the character to go from being trigger happy to being grim and gritty.
Mm,
It's that crucial Steve Grant, Circle of Blood limited series that recasts the character. And I think it does in an interesting way. I mean, I was in a way surprised how interesting the story of Circle of Blood is, how much it is part of the story of comics in the '80s, that we don't talk about it alongside Watchmen or Dark Knight. But to take a character who had been that badly treated, right? He's shooting at cabbies. He's this sort of stick figure for Spider-Man to make fun of, right? Like
mm,
you got problems, Buster. And then to take this character and to say no, 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 no. He takes it seriously. He takes himself seriously. The world he lives in justifies his anger. And then he runs into a conspiracy, which is weirder than he can imagine. And I think Stephen Grant solved, I don't want to say he solved the problem, but he's one of the writers like Barron, like Ennis, who found a way of taking a character who's in a very tight little knot, right? I mean, he's very constrained. He doesn't have powers. He's always going to shoot. He's ridiculously angry. So he's there's so many things that are pre-given. And you have a small number of writers who found a way of making it very fresh. And Grant's way, I think, is one of the interesting ways, because what he did was he took this character who's very two-dimensional and put him in this three-dimensional world. And he's like, I don't want to know that. I just want to know who the villain is. And the warden's like, no, no, it's more complicated. They're respectable citizens. And, you don't really understand what's going on. And the Punisher's like, I don't want to know about Gray, damn it. I just think that's a, intrinsically interesting use of the character. The angry man who comes up against something he can't quite understand. I think there's a lot of mileage in that. But for Marvel, of course, the character is so problematic because of the appropriation by the far right. That Unite the Right rally must have been just absolutely shocking for people in Marvel. Because you have, we shall not be replaced, and the this group and that group shall not replace us, with Patches, Frank Patches.
Oh, there's a question later on
And
in
let's just say that is why he's in the transdimensional realm, right? I
yeah,
mean, that's where you send a character to depoliticize him.
yeah,
Like, what do you mean he's a political character? He's surrounded by monsters. He's in a green goo environment.
yeah. Fuck, man. Yeah.
New York City.
I'm not going to do
There's
it.
no
No,
New
I'm
York
going to
City
wait.
in this
Well,
story.
okay, I'm going to do it. I'll just do
Yeah,
it.
please.
So this was a question that we had for later, but
We
you're
had
kind
a
of getting there
progression
already. Yeah.
to get there. So
Sorry.
yeah,
So,
just
uh, so I'm just reading it from how
Sure,
we have it
please.
written down. But as a follow-up to that, how do you feel? What are your thoughts on the logo change recently because of the right making the Punisher symbol like such a right-wing
Look,
thing? Like how do you and then they changed the symbol now, and then the right wing, being so against it. Like how do you feel about that?
yeah, I mean, I don't feel moved. I don't want to be moved by or against the right. I don't want them in my head in that way.
Hmm.
Um, you know, I don't want to like his logo because the right doesn't.
Right.
I hate that kind of lack of independent thinking,
Do you
really.
do you
Uh,
think that
I think Marvel overproduced Punisher comics. I think
Mhm,
Marvel kind of blundered into this over a period of decades, right? Where
mhm.
they take a character who is just so intense, so he is such a. The phrase I use in the introduction is that he pushes open the Overton window, right, of what's acceptable. Okay, so what is the Punisher's answer? Shooting people. How many people? Tens of thousands. Okay. And he's on the cover of a comic that's being sold to all ages audience. Yes. So I think that little nutshell thing, Marvel pump out, especially late 80s, 90s, pump out uh, Punisher stories. And sometimes it's not even stories. Think about the 10 issues of the Punisher Armory, right? Which might have, I think, be sold. I don't remember it saying for mature audiences. Maybe it did, but so a company that produces a comic book that offers survivalist instructions in how to amass weapons of mass destruction in your basement. And then they're sort of surprised that the character is adopted by people who are angry at the government. So, you know, it's fascinating to me how much of an outlier he is. That you have a character like the Hulk who symbolizes anger, and you can sell his T-shirts to 8-year-olds, and it doesn't matter because the Hulk is such a kind of fantastical character, right? I mean,
Mhm.
he's green and he's big. But when you're selling 8-year-olds T-shirts of the Punisher, you're not just selling a kind of like cartoon version of a kind of like cathartic anger. You're in a way, I think, encouraging that anger. And I don't feel at all kind of censorious or ooh, tisk tisk Marvel. But I do think there is an irony in this story.
Yeah. Do you think that the changing of the logo pushes
Oh, right,
that
the
character?
logo.
Yeah. Do you
I
think
think
that
that's a
do you think it pushes the character uh uh for better character development that he's changing it, or do you think that that should be left alone?
I think it's the usual Marvel lane bullshit.
Yeah.
It's such a wonky image. I mean, I recognize that my aesthetics are not the aesthetics of the sort of mass comics audience. You know, I find the look of the Baron and through the Ennis run. I actually think a lot of the Punisher's been well drawn, well executed. Um, in general, the fantasy, the Frankencastle, the Doctor Strange issues, those are probably some of my least favorite Punisher issues.
Do you like the new logo, or are you
It's just
not feeling it?
it just feels like a corporate effort to depoliticize a character, and that it's too late. The horse led fled the barn.
Yeah.
Civil society now owns the character. Marvel, I think Marvel's going to profit from back issues, right? Trade paperbacks and so on and so forth. But I think it's going to be a long time before that character can be used in the way he was used in the mid 80s.
Fair.
that that's something that I noticed in the book is you talk about kind of like the rise of the Punisher being on the same at least time frame of
Absolutely. In
frame.
tandem would be the way to put it, right? It's like in parallel. The crime rate and the Punisher success go up and up, and then the crime rate peaks. It stays sort of at about, I don't know, 1,700, 1,600 murders through the early 90s, and then it drops, and the character doesn't change because those decades have established a certain kind of character, a certain kind of traumatic response, right? He's living in a world where 1,500 or more New Yorkers are dying a year as a result of gun violence,
Right.
right? And so when it goes down to 400, he's still acting like it's, you know, some kind of a absolute urban emergency.
But like
Sorry,
on no,
I have a lot of opinions about the Punisher.
oh, I
That's what we want.
that
That's
is
what we
what
want.
we want. Um, but in the book you reference, kind of like the simultaneous rise of like Reaganism and the Punisher both kind of symbiotically uh growing.
And I think we forget how much Reagan's election in 1980 is about crime. I
Right.
was struck going back to the early Reagan administration, how many initiatives had to do with crime and policing, giving city, police chiefs more money, more equipment. The whole SWAT turn is in the 80s. I'd literally forgotten, even though I lived through that period, just how much that first administration is taking on sort of urban issues, but with a new kind of slant, pro death penalty, longer prison sentences, and so on.
But then you
Yeah.
you see these things whether you are reading a book or live through it. I understand that there's a difference between it,
Mm.
but you see those things, but then you see the Punisher who is constantly taking justice into his own hands and kind of bypassing and almost adversarially like opposing the police department.
Certainly the courts. There's very few stories where police officers see him as an enemy, but certainly judges, I think, routinely regard him as an enemy, and I think that's reasonable. Buried in this isn't just a kind of critique of the state, right? He isn't just impatient. I think a lot of the time the character is written as thoroughly disaffected, that he has a kind of burn it all down
Ooh,
quality.
I
He's
like
not
that.
restoring. He's not, I don't think, most of the time. And again, there is no he, right? The key thing about the character is the writers. I mean, in a way, that's one reason why I wrote about him, is because I have more interest in New York and how kind of popular culture and the city and the country interact than I do in describing superhero aesthetics and visuals. And I love a good comic art and the whole question of how people use panels and various storytelling devices to move the reader along. But nobody talks about the Punisher in those terms, right? Some great artists have worked on the Punisher, but the Punisher is important because he's angry, because he's murderous, because he's on the outer edge of the Marvel universe.
He's an
And
anti-hero.
what's that?
He's an anti-hero.
He's an anti-hero, but
Yeah.
he's an anti-hero that never things will never happen to him that happened to his paperback counterparts.
Mhm.
Mac Bolan got folded into the government, right? The executioner. And if you've read any executioner books from, say, the mid 90s on, he's part of a team, right? I don't think that's ever going to be Frank Castle. And nor is he able to kind of descend into madness in the way that I think probably the actual lifestyle would produce.
Oh, that okay. So that's fun. That brings up again. I just texted Chad and I was like, I'm gonna ask this at the end, but I'm gonna do it now just because of the way you ended that off. Have you seen The Punisher on Netflix with
Yeah, of
John
course.
Barenthal? Okay, so how do you feel about his portrayal of the Punisher? And do you agree with it? Do you not agree with it? Because he's got kind of that like loony, kind of crazy, but he also has that burn it all down mentality that you were just mentioning.
I mean the comic, and I don't mean comic book, but I mean the silly, the humorous answer, of course, is Dolph, right? If somebody says who's the best Punisher, right? Because Dolph Lundgren will never grow old as a punchline, right? Once every 3, 4, 5 years, I will watch that first movie and laugh at it. And it won't quit. It's like,
Yeah.
why are they in the sewers? Why are there ninjas? What kind of city does he live in? And my line on Thomas Jane is that it's absolutely believable that he would have gone into some kind of killing mode after those horrific events in Puerto Rico.
I love that movie, but
That is
that's it. Yeah.
so well done, and it's gruesome. I just don't believe that this is somebody who would have continued his campaign. I think Thomas Jane sells us a story of somebody who's fundamentally healthy, who has a traumatic event. Whereas I think the Punisher is fundamentally unhealthy, right? There's
Yeah.
something in that guy's background that explains
So Thomas Jane's
permanent
character,
campaign.
after he avenged his family, he was done.
It's like a
Story arc is over. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because he hasn't given you that sense that his soul is ridden with pus, right? That there's
Right.
something kind of toxic about his actual inner nature.
Hmm.
Just that he's a good man who's been terribly treated by the world around him.
And John Bernthal's character.
Renthal comes closest. He's got that kind of intense thing. Um, I think I'd give him an A minus. And I
I
said
feel
this,
like he nailed it. I feel like he nailed it pretty
I'll
good.
tell
Yeah.
you, I'll tell you what I think of as the kind of, pardon the expression, the platonic ideal is Kiefer Sutherland's version of Jack Bauer. I've
Ooh,
read
I
all
like
the
that.
I've read all the Jack Bauer books, and boy, Kiefer and Jack are. There's so many moments where it's like, wait a minute, am I watching a documentary? Is this right? And if I see an interview with Kiefer Sutherland, it's like, is that Jack pretending to be this guy? So I don't know if Bernthal's gotten quite that kind of. That's why I give him an A minus rather than an A. I think Kiefer Sutherland gets the A for a different character, but a related.
Right. Yeah.
so kind of following up on that with the Punisher without like fully in like a live action
Mm-hmm.
situation without fully divulging the character into like some form of psychosis. Do you think like kind of where they're going with the John Barenthal of like the PTSD aspect of it? Does that seem the most plausible way to do the character justice?
I think
In
in a
live
way. Sorry, go ahead. I'm terrible.
action? No,
You've
that was
been
the
great.
end of it. Like, it is in a live action situation, is it better to not let them go into psychosis or but let it be like a PTSD sort of like mind split. Like how would you in future adaptations and depictions, what would you like to see change for the character to breathe kind of new life? Because you even mentioned in the book that like they just kind of like rehash the character
Is
just
such a danger, right? I
for
mean,
for
given
another
how
time. How do you breathe new life into the character but still like pay respect to who Frank Castle and the character is?
hmm, I think the best, the most successful versions of the character, which I tend to think have transpired in print, are versions which understand that the best way of thinking about the character is opaque and ultimately not quite understandable because he is kind of a force of nature. That there is something that if they've gone in this demonic direction, is not entirely sort of artificial and goofy. That there is something demonic and just otherworldly about somebody who kills that many people for that long. And I think that in a way, the Netflix version, and this conversation is helping me realize what my complaint is. The Netflix version is a little bit too algebraic. You know, this happens to this guy, and does this, and then this compounds it, and boom. And I don't think he's algebra. I think he's chaos.
Like he should just be out there killing like everybody that's doing wrong, as opposed to like in the show where they kind of give him a direction and he's only killing those people.
I think a focused Punisher can work. I don't think he has to be, an unguided missile.
Yeah.
Um, but there's so much therapy culture in the kind of Netflix thing. It's like Frank, talk to us. And I kind of like with Kiefer Sunderland in doing Jack Bauer in those later seasons. There were lots of scenes where you were like, I don't know what this guy could do. Right? Like, is he going to point a nuclear weapon at the president?
Yeah.
Is he going to just hold a giant, right, an armed device and say, Mr. President? That sense of menace is so powerful. And I fear that it's not Bernthal, that it's the Netflix formula, that they want to be able to say, take high school students and say, this character acts this way because of PTSD and Netflix believes, you know what I mean? It's a little tame, and I think it's an unruly character.
So are you worried or excited for the Punisher to reprise his role, John Bernthal to reprise his role as the Punisher in the upcoming, now that it's not Netflix anymore, it's the the
Right.
MCU. How do you feel about that? Do you think it's going to be the same, or are you excited or disappointed?
I'm neither. It's a B plus. I'm looking forward to it. I suspect it'll be tamed down a little bit. Um,
Probably,
to
unfortunately.
me, there's a big disjuncture between I'm talking about the Netflix, not I can't predict what Disney will tone down. I mean, it might be exactly what I'm talking about. But with the Netflix, if you think of, say, that scene with the women in the bathroom, the fight scene,
Yeah, in
the set
season 2.
pieces,
Yeah.
yeah, season two, the set pieces where they're after the girl, the set pieces are, I think, by far the most successful thing of the series. And, those 4 minutes or whatever that is are just marvelous, right? Just so well done. Um, and, the problem isn't right now for Netflix, let's say, Disney might be different. I'm not sure. But for Netflix, the problem isn't how do we have a good fight scene on a train or in a bar bathroom. The problem is sort of motivation in the world around them. And to me, the most successful versions of the character understand that the trauma is so deep that it's kind of an unquenchable fire.
Yeah.
And I think Bernthal's too rooted in the Vietnam, the PTSD to be fire. It's
Okay.
social. It's too kids don't start a war unless it's a good war. Americans, think about war next time. And
As opposed to what
guys,
you said earlier, that is that he's just chaos.
yeah, he's a
Yeah,
chaos agent.
I like that. I
But he's
really
a
like that.
chaos agent who operates in a universe, and that universe has all kinds of amazing storytelling possibilities. So to me, it's the juxtaposition. I'll tell you, a lot of my favorite Punisher bits are comedic, right? Like the what is it? Oh, I don't know if it's Spider Gwen, but oh no, it's Squirrel Girl, where Frank starts to pull out his gun because he sees Doctor Doom, and Squirrel Girl's friend says, "No, no, it's cosplay," and Frank's like, "Oh, sorry," as he puts back this giant shotgun that he just happens to carry around in his pocket, and then of course we learn that it really was Doctor Doom.
That's
I don't know
funny.
why. I find that kind of enjoyable watching the Marvel Universe cope with this ball of fire.
Yeah, the
You know, I'm
given
in Times Square, surrounded by hundreds of people. Why don't I shoot this villain?
yeah. No, I really like that. And as you and Jake were kind of going back and forth of like the straight chaos versus the this is the path that I'm on.
Hmm.
Uh I I mean you've done so much research into this. Um is there a way to do that in a lot? I mean, this can be a very, very simple yes or no.
Hmm.
Is there a way to do that in a live action that's convincing without needing a season and a half of backstory like what we got through, the Daredevil season 2 where we introduced the Punisher and then his entire solo first season? Is there a way to do that where even though he's kind of like this chaotic anti-hero, um is there a way to create that pure chaos motivation that you've referenced either in a shorter amount of time or without having to have like an ulterior motive behind it for
That's a,
live action? Because in comics, like, one series can end and then the other series can either pick up where it left off or start a new story, and we just already know who the character is. But like in a live action situation, is there a way to do that?
I wouldn't want to rule anything out. I'm not sure I can think of a film that does quite what you do. I'm struck by how we are still trying to, or not we, in a way, let's call it the industry, is still trying to figure out this question of formats, right? By the 90s, let's say the 90-minute action film had kind of been perfected, right? The 3 or 4 act Seagal film where the rhythm, the story beats are all really enjoyable and clear, and then they kind of beat that formula to death. And then in the 21st century, you get this 10 episodes, 8 episodes, an hour long, a season. Um, I have to say that just as there are examples of 90-minute films that don't really tell you much about the characters, there are plenty of examples of 10 or 8 episode seasons that tell you in a way too much about the characters. I mean, how many times do we have to see Karen Page and, what's his name?
Foggy Nelson.
Augie Nelson,
Yeah.
fret about things. It's like, I get it. They're New Yorkers. They fret. They don't have powers. They're surrounded by things they don't understand. But
You have a day job.
Like, yeah.
yeah,
A little bit here and there, but like focus on the main character. Yeah.
yeah. I tend to think that there are two key things. One is here humor, and the other is the villain. I think the best of Bernthal does have a note of humor, right? That where he and the character kind of know that they're being crazy. Um, but if you think of somebody like Killmonger,
Yeah.
Hmm.
you don't have to do a lot once you have a villain that good and an actor that good.
Oh
Right.
And
yeah.
I'm not sure. I mean, Travolta was delightfully kind of over the top, but I'm not sure on screen Frank's ever had a villain as good as that.
Yeah. I love it. And there's been kind of a yin and yang over here between Chad and I through this whole podcast is I love villains. I think there's so
Hmm.
much better storytelling for villains than there is for heroes and like why they are the way that they are. And then like Lex Luthor is probably one of my favorites because he thinks he's the good guy.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh
yeah.
yeah.
Kingpin has
Yeah.
some of the same dynamic.
I love that. I love that. So yeah, I totally
Yeah.
hear what you're saying. That's
Yeah, I got into this business in the book of, I didn't spend enough time on it, of thinking about how the villains in the Punisher universe are also opinionated about New York. And they also kind of overlap with Frank's sort of thoughts about New York.
Hmm.
Kingpin really does want to save the city, and he thinks that one person has to do it. Well, that's kind of what Frank believes. They just argue about who's the right person to be in charge of
Yeah,
this awesome task.
I love that. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah, but a pinch of humor and a good villain, you're a long way, and I think 90 minutes should be fine. I mean, in a way, I will watch the Bernthal, but I promise you there'll be moments where I'm thinking, come on, I got half an hour more till they're even going to
Yeah.
get to the next part of the story.
And there's like the
Or
episodes that
half an
are
hour
just
before you
like,
can see a gun.
yeah, and there's like an episode here and there that are just have nothing to do with this. They're not
Yeah,
pushing the
they're lodged in the
storyline.
camera.
Yeah. It's
Their
like,
cars
come
being
on.
The
repaired.
Yeah.
unfortunate
Yeah, that car's
TV.
yeah.
And there's a crime going on, go figure, and
Yeah.
Frank, leave it alone. I can't.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, part of what we're talking about is just how sophisticated the audience has gotten, right? I mean, in a way, that's what we don't talk about enough is the audience. And, Marvel has to kind of keep up with the audience, right? Especially nowadays. They make some move with a character and 100
Fa-
podcasters are dissecting it.
Fans are a tough crowd.
Yeah.
Tough crowd.
Yeah. And also the character is harder, I think, to write now because in the 80s and early 90s, there was a sense of urgency. I think Marvel in the 80s and early 90s, because the crime peaks around in New York around 1990, 91, and it remains quite stubbornly high through the first half of the decade. So that 10-year period, 85 to 95, is the kind of golden age for the Punisher. Notice that's the period in the early 90s where there are 5 Punisher titles being published a month. It's astonishing, right? Given that character, how inflexible he is. Of course, one of them is 100 years in the future, right? And the Armory, so there's no character in that. But it's 5 titles. And I don't know where I was going with that, but that is oh, I know that when you're in that 10-year period, 85 to 95, you don't have to motivate the reader or the character. It is absolutely a kind of membrane between entertainment and the society, right? You're reading about rising crime. Frank Castle is dealing with rising crime. It's, you're watching the local news. Frank Castle's reenacting the local news, but with a better ending.
Yeah. You pick up the newspaper and then you pick up a comic the next day. Yeah.
And by the time you get to Bernie Getz on the subway, it's like, wait a minute, am I reading the comic or am I reading about a guy named Bernie Getz?
I love that comparison. I've never heard that before. I love that.
I'll let you in on a secret. I moved to New York in 83. Getz's attack is what, 84, 85? I forget which. I'm blanking, but it's right there in the mid 80s. And he and I at the time were dead ringers for each other. I got free drinks because people thought I was Bernie Getz. And I was like, I'm not Bernie Getz. And people would be like, no, I'm giving you a drink. And I once got a free cab ride. He was like, Mr. Getz, I kid you not. And I was listening in the late 80s, a couple years later, to Jane's Addiction's Nothing Shocking, which is a pretty intense album,
Mhm.
on headphones on a Walkman with a tape going through Times Square. And a young guy was saying, Getz, you're a dead man. You're a dead man. And I'm listening to this like album, like, whoa, Perry Farrell. And I noticed that people around me are kind of a little like nervous. So I take off my headphones and I'm like, Getz, you're a dead man. And yeah. So again, the absolute gap between what we were studying and writing about and what our exams were about and what was motivating people in the actual city. And there's the book.
That's that. I mean, every aspect of that is
Horrible, boring.
Not boring. Definitely not boring.
The opposite of boring. I mean,
I'm
in
a pessimist, which is one reason I love the character.
I mean, sad, but I get it. Like, like
Hmm.
it makes sense for the character.
I have a story for you. I think you might find it entertaining,
Please and
and I
thank
haven't
you.
told it before. Um, I was writing the
That's
conclusion.
have you said that too first?
I
Because you said that we're the most important. So
Oh yeah, yeah, you are. That's why you got the
I'm being
story.
the pessimist here.
So
I know
so
Alan's important, but
no, I was writing the conclusion. I find conclusions difficult. And I suddenly realized, oh my God, I'm just surrounded by blood. I have been reading for 4 years. I have been reading paperback novels from the 70s and 80s. I've been watching crime films from the 70s and 80s. I've been reading, there's roughly 1,000 Punisher stories to read, but I figure I'd read another couple thousand of Batman and Fool Killer and Daredevil and, stories set in New York or stories with intense, sort of violent oriented characters. And I was like, oh my God, this is too much. This is just beginning to infect my, nighttime, right? I'm dreaming about, urban New York in the 70s. And so with a friend, I started watching studio era film musicals. And I found that Judy Garland was the safe space that my soul needed after 4 years of Frank Castle.
That's amazing. I love Judy Garland.
Oh yeah, she's
Do you
I mean,
think
what's the worst thing about Garland is how people fixate on the Wizard of Oz, and that's like the least interesting part of her story. So
yeah,
she'd already done a whole bunch of interesting movies,
yeah. My
and
mom was a big fan and I saw a lot of Judy Garland
I
growing
mean,
up.
we're both from Minnesota.
oh, I thought you were going to say from uh, the Enchanted. What's the name of the place she goes to?
Uh,
Um,
Uh,
the fantasy land, Oz. I thought you were going
Oz.
to say we're
Oh,
both from Oz.
yeah, we're both from Oz. I do have a tattoo of the Wizard of Oz,
Hmm,
but we
yeah.
won't get into that because it's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
degenerate.
No, but it is striking how if you spend your time in say, let's say 80s, 90s pulp culture, right? I read all the Death Wish books, all the Dirty Harry books, right? Some of them are novelizations, but there's like 10 Dirty Harry books where he's just doing stuff, right? He's
Hmm.
going camping and he suddenly has to kill people. It's like, well, I thought I got away from this. Um, you go back to the culture of the 30s and 40s, and they are they're bottling all that stuff up, right? They are not talking about themselves the way that the culture does in the 80s and 90s. I mean, there is just such a emphasis on, you know, everybody being happy in
Are
is let's say in things like musicals. So it is a yin yang situation. I have both sides as a nerd is I can watch something from the 30s or 40s where it's just so sweet and it's so patriotic and it's so wholesome and eat it like vanilla ice cream and then read a or watch a violent movie and
do you think that are you working on anything else or
I'm working
are
on a book on the musicals on
oh
I'm,
really? So you're
yeah, yeah, yeah,
literally
no,
going to the other side.
yeah, no, I'm
Okay.
sorry to say I think the Punisher is my last sort of comics related thing.
That's yeah.
why are you apologizing?
Well, let's put
Yeah.
this way. As a kid, I was into movies before I was into comics. And as a kid, I was sort of even then I was intimidated by just how many books there were on movies.
Mhm.
And I will say that once I got tenure and I thought, well, what do I really want to write about? And I thought comics. Part of the appeal was that there hadn't been enough, right?
Yeah.
And that you look at your own bookshelf in 2000, right, or 2002, and it's like, man, there's not that many good books. I mean, yeah, there's some coffee table books, and Jules Pfeiffer writes this delightful book about superheroes in 1965. But that bookshelf I had was pretty small. And I
So
wanted to contribute to that, but
so
now
now you're working on a musical book?
Yeah. See, I finally had an idea for a book, which I don't think nobody's done before. That certainly is overlooked, and it has to do with hidden messages in films that people don't think as having messages. So it's
Oh,
called The Hidden Musical.
that's wonderful. I can't wait.
It'll probably take about 18. It's that's it. That's my last book.
We're here for it. I can't wait.
You're funny. And also just the whole what is the opposite of Frank Castle and but still doing 20th century American culture? And it's like the film musical is definitely as far away from
I love the range. Oh, I mean, that's amazing. I can't wait for it.
I also
well,
just
I
love
like
musicals.
sorry.
Uh, what's your go-to musical? Sorry to cut you off.
Oh no.
What's your favorite musical or opera?
I think of no, I'm not an opera person. I think of basically two kinds of musicals. The canon, and of the big ones, I have to say Meet Me in St. Louis. I think it is close to perfection. Um, Minnelli is such an extraordinary visual artist. It's a film where if you take a say 4K or a high def version and you freeze it almost anywhere in the film, you have a perfect composition
Hmm.
because he's moving actors through 3D space, but he has such a sensitive, exquisitely attuned sense of what he's doing that you can pause at any moment and it's organized and it's elegant. Anyway, so on the one hand, you have those kind of MGM sort of peaks, which I think are sort of peaks of cinema in general. But for me, I also love the forgotten musical, the low budget. I love a lot of those, especially the 40s. Um, I mean, it's just moments from these things. I love watching Betty Grable at the end of Pinup Girl marching with 200 WACs, Women Auxiliary Corps. And it's 200 military women and one famous Hollywood actress, and they're all doing this march. And it's so 1944. You don't get that in American movies. It's almost surreal how just for 10 minutes, Betty Grable is going, right, march. And all these women are following her. And it's like, what is this country? So just as I was trying to understand the 70s by doing Frank, 70s and 80s, now I want to understand the 40s.
I love it. Love it.
It's my other favorite decade, I guess you can say.
I mean, it makes sense of just trying to understand who we are as a nation and political landscapes and everything, which makes so much sense for the I don't want to undermine it by just phrasing it as the career that you've built. From your other books, this book, being a professor and everything like that, like it's so much more than just a career. Like you've influenced
A
and
waste of time. Sorry.
I didn't
No,
I didn't say it. Those aren't my words.
I
Uh,
mean, it is an unusual academic thing, right? I mean, most academics are more focused on reaching academics.
but this is like right up our alley. So this is
No,
amazing.
that's not. I mean, I have no particular. I mean, to me, I'm interested in people who want to know about New York in this sort of and through the lens of the Punisher, whether they teach somewhere or whether they, I don't know,
And to be able to tie
office.
those two things together, the, fake, bringing it to a reality and like looking through that lens, I think that's amazing. And
Thank you.
Chad is reading the book right now, and then he's sending it to me so that I can read it.
very
Unfortunately, he
familiar.
got it first,
I
but
so
uh,
well,
very
I
excited to
have
read it.
more access to our email. I might just have to buy the PDF so that we can read it side by side. Um,
Yeah.
and
But
by
I think what you did is amazing and really unique, and I'm
Thanks.
really excited. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank
um,
you.
yeah, thank you so much for coming on here to talk about this book and I mean, not just your perspective, but so much of the history and where you are looking to go next with your works, especially in the realm of our society, the history of this country, and everything like that. Um, I know that we really appreciate being schooled and educated by everything that you're doing.
Oh,
Um,
you're too kind.
but before we go, please tell our listeners where they can find uh, copies of your book, both physical and digital. And also, if they have more questions about you, your past works, your future works, and how they can reach you.
Um, the publisher's Intellect. The books are Cultural History, The Punisher, Marvel Comics, and the Politics of Vengeance. The cheapest copies, at least for a while, were on Forbidden Planet's website. I don't know if they've sold out, but they had some at a reasonable price. Amazon will at some point discount it because that's how their algorithms work, and you got to know like that 72 hours where it's suddenly affordable. But the main thing is through the publisher's website. I did sell some copies at the Mocha Fest just last weekend, and we had a book signing at Barnes and Noble I don't know, 3 weeks ago. But it's hard. There's a lot of books out there, and just figuring out how to let people know about it is a challenge, especially like I say, outside of comics.
We'll do our
But
best to get it out
you
there.
guys have been great, and um, really, in a way, I hope it's clear. I have no interest in sort of being like, oh, I'm an academic who writes on comics. I'm an academic. Um, but nor am I just a fan, right? I mean, in other words, it's not, oh, I'm important. It's let's take ourselves and our history seriously.
Right.
And so it is a kind of, I think of it as it's a thick book, but I try not to write it as abstract. It's not meant to be an abstract or academic book, but it is kind of a serious book.
Right.
Anyway, that's the hope. Thanks for
I
letting me
mean,
rant.
no, my God, please rant all you want. I mean, seriously, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank
We,
you.
yeah, my God, that was so much fun. We got so much information, and hopefully our listeners did too. And hopefully, listeners, they'll go buy your book.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Have a good night. Appreciate you so much.
Appreciate it as well. Thank you.
Bye.